This is New York City. It may just be one city, but it sure doesn't feel like it. Cross a bridge or ride a few subway stops, and almost everything changes. The skyline looks different, the streets move differently, even the cultures shift. The city is separated into boroughs, and they're almost like a city within a city. People don't just say they're from New York City, they say they're from the Bronx, or Queens, or Brooklyn. These are neighborhoods with separate histories, and in many ways, separate identities. But how did this end up even happening? How did the most iconic city in the US end up with perhaps the strangest internal structure? Well, to understand that, we have to look back to a time before the five boroughs were united, when they were rivals, and the decision to merge them was anything but inevitable. Until the very end of the 19th century, what we now call New York City didn't exist, at least not in the way we know it. Manhattan was the city of New York. The Bronx was still mostly farmland. Queens and Staten Island were made up of small towns. And Brooklyn? Brooklyn was a completely separate city. In fact, it was the third largest in America by 1860, just behind Philadelphia and the city of New York. Of course, these lines created distinct cultures. Brooklyn was seen as more suburban, more Protestant, and more middle class than the crowded, immigrant-heavy Catholic streets of Manhattan, for example. And yet, even as the region remained divided in identity and governance, some were already imagining a future where it could act as one. Since the late 1820s, there had been some discussion of a unified city. In 1857, the New York State Legislature resolved that the region surrounding New York City should become one body, to improve harbor facilities and link the systems of trade. They attempted to do so by government vote, but distrust of large government projects killed the plans before it went anywhere. Just a year later, residents of Staten Island burned down a quarantine hospital in protest of New York City's public health orders back in 1858, a sign of how resistant some boroughs were to outside control. And yet, despite all that independence, the boundaries were starting to blur. The harbor connected all of them. Goods flowed through shared waterways. People were commuting across city lines every day. The industrial economy didn't stop at the rivers. By the second half of the 19th century, these cities and towns were starting to function less like neighbors and more like part of the same machine. But their systems weren't built to reflect that. Each ran its own docks, streetcars, ferries, and public safety departments. These separate networks made the region less efficient and more vulnerable. Business leaders and civic reformers saw it clearly. They needed a unified port, a regional government, and a single system to manage the city's future growth. Andrew Haswell Green, known as the father of Greater New York, led the effort to consolidate. It became the most ambitious municipal merger in US history. Beneath the surface, there were motives beyond just the ease of everything being unified. The state legislature in Albany was growing more powerful, but more importantly, the city of Chicago was growing rapidly, on course to become the most populated city in the country. It had its railroads and Great Lakes traffic, making it the premier city of the Midwest. In 1893, it was chosen over New York as the site of the World's Exhibition Fair, which was a massive upset. When the fair turned out to be a massive success, Chicago became the most praised city in the country. The fear among the New York elites was that, without consolidation, their city might just lose its edge, or its influence. Many remembered how the power and prestige of Philadelphia, once America's financial capital, had slowly bled away once it was surpassed by New York in the late 1930s. So the solution was quite clear: merge the counties, centralize power, and modernize the city. But obviously, not everyone actually agreed. Manhattan supported it, so did most of Queens and the Bronx. But in Brooklyn, the reaction was different. For decades, Brooklyn had prided itself on being a city in its own right. It had its own infrastructure, institutions, and a sense of identity completely separate from Manhattan. Many saw the proposed merger as a hostile takeover. In 1894, voters across the region were asked to weigh in. The results weren't even close. They were razor-thin. Brooklyn voted in favor by just 277 votes, a margin of less than 0.25%. In Staten Island, opposition was just as fierce. Residents feared that city governance from Manhattan would neglect their isolated borough and disrupt local control. Across the region, critics warned that consolidation would dilute the homogeneous Protestant civic life. empower political machines like Tammany Hall, and erase local traditions. But the promise of better water access, financial backing, and regional development eventually swayed public opinion in these two areas. Water was a big one. You see, by the 1890s, especially Brooklyn had a serious problem. The borough had grown quickly, but its water system hadn't kept up. It relied on wells and small reservoirs in Queens, but those were starting to run dry. Residents complained about poor water pressure and dirty tap water. And to make matters worse, pumping too much groundwater from underground aquifers allowed salt water to seep in from the coast, contaminating the supply. Manhattan, on the other hand, had a much better system. Its water came from the Croton Aqueduct, a 41-mile engineering project that carried clean water from upstate. Brooklyn didn't have anything like that. So when the idea of consolidation came up, water was one of the biggest reasons to say yes, and in a growing industrial city, that mattered. In the end, newspapers pushed the plan, state legislators approved it, and business leaders made the case that resisting the merger would mean being left behind. So on January 1st, 1898, the city of Greater New York officially came into being. The term borough was introduced to describe each of the new administrative divisions within the unified city. It had been used before in England and a few US states, but never in this way, as parts of a single centralized government. It included 5 boroughs, 5 counties, and more than 3.4 million people, making it the second most populated city in the world at the time behind only London. In Manhattan, there was celebration. Thousands filled City Hall Park for fireworks, speeches, and the swearing-in of the city's first mayor, Robert A. Van Wyck. The mood was optimistic. Progress had won, but across the river, it felt more like a loss. In Brooklyn, the reaction was quiet, even bitter. Local papers described the day as funereal. A city with its own institutions, identity, and history now answered to Manhattan. Overnight, more than 40 separate municipalities were expected to fully coordinate across borough lines. City Hall took on new authority, but borough presidents were created to manage local interests and prevent a total centralization of power. Obviously, the infrastructure still worked like 5 different cities for a long time. Transportation was still a major issue. Brooklyn and Queens had grown quickly, but their links to Manhattan were limited. The subway wouldn't open until 1904, and even then, most lines only ran into Manhattan. It took decades to connect the boroughs underground. Staten Island wasn't connected at all, and still isn't, though the bridges helped. Besides the Brooklyn Bridge that opened a few years earlier in 1883, the Williamsburg Bridge opened in 1903, followed by the Manhattan and Queensboro bridges in 1909. Finally, the New York City subway system unified in 1940. When the city purchased the Interborough Rapid Transit Company and the Brooklyn Manhattan Transit Corporation, merging them with the existing city-owned independent subway system. This brought all 3 major subway operating companies under city control, creating a single, unified subway system. Now, the most interesting part of this unification was that of the Bronx, given it was already part of Manhattan before becoming its own borough after consolidation. Let me explain. During the mid-19th century, the Bronx technically didn't exist in any official capacity. It was just part of the southernmost region of Westchester County, serving as a transitional zone between urban Manhattan and rural New England. Much of the land was just farmland, marshes, with a few key roads and bridges scattered about. But in 1846, the town of West Farms was carved out of it. Then came Morrisania, then Kingsbridge, as the population in these areas rapidly grew. The reasons for this was simply due to its proximity to Manhattan, being just a few miles north, making them ideal for commuting into the city and economic spillover. But as the city of New York kept expanding, these towns were eventually swallowed up by it in 1874, pulled into the city's orbit as its need for land, housing, and infrastructure grew. This area became known as the Annexed District, a strange in-between, legally part of New York, but still geographically apart. The rest of the land east of the Bronx River followed in annexation in 1895, until the area was formally consolidated into Greater New York in 1898, becoming the borough of the Bronx. But legally, it was still part of the New York County, which included Manhattan and the Bronx together. Things started to change once the first subway line to reach the Bronx opened in 1904. Suddenly, it made living there even more cheap and easy. The population exploded, more than doubling between 1900 and 1910, as farmland quickly gave way to dense city blocks. This rapid growth created the need for better local governance, and in 1914, the Bronx finally became its own county, with its own court system and administration. By 1930, it had more than 1.2 million residents. Staten Island, on the other hand, has never had any public transit connecting it to the rest of New York. There's just the Verrazano Narrows Bridge and the ferries. It's always been a little apart though, ever since the very beginning of the US. Staten Island was one of the strongest loyalist enclaves in the colonies, so much so that British forces used it as their base of operations in 1776. George Washington even called the locals our most inveterate enemies. It became part of New York City in 1898, but the subway never came, and neither did the density. For most of the 20th century, Staten Island stayed quiet, suburban, disconnected, and politically out of step with the rest of the city. The point here is that the boroughs within this newly unified New York City were distinct. Technically, it was one city, but daily life told a different story. Staten Island remained semi-rural. Queens was still stitched together from old town centers. And while power was centralized in New York City Hall, the people still lived with borough boundaries that didn't go away. Because, you see, New York City may be a single municipality, but it's still 5 separate counties. Manhattan is New York County. Brooklyn is Kings County, Queens is Queens County, the Bronx is Bronx County, and Staten Island is Richmond County. This is a legal leftover from the 1898 consolidation. The boroughs were never fully absorbed into a single system. Instead, the city kept them intact, politically, geographically, and culturally. Borough boundaries shaped how decisions were made. Each one developed its own political structure, centered around local leaders and party organizations. There was no single machine that controlled New York City politics after consolidation. Each borough developed its own. Tammany Hall dominated Manhattan through its network of ward bosses and district leaders. Brooklyn's Kings County Democrats built their power through a system of political clubs tied to neighborhoods and union halls. In Queens, the county party grew through land deals and judicial appointments, while the Bronx was shaped by the rise of Edward J. Flynn, who became one of the most powerful Democratic figures in the country. Staten Island's organization remained smaller, but it operated within the same structure. These clubs had real control. They could decide who ran for office and who didn't. They gave out city jobs through personal connections. Loyalty mattered. If someone got a job through the club, they were expected to show up, donate, and vote the right way. The club kept track of who delivered and who didn't. That's how local leaders stayed in power. Leaders like Charles Murphy in Manhattan and John McCooey in Brooklyn set the tone for how borough power worked inside a so-called unified city. No single figure controlled the city. Instead, power was negotiated borough by borough, deal by deal. If a candidate wanted to run citywide, they needed approval from every corner of the city. The machines controlled access, and the borough lines defined the terms. That structure never really disappeared. The clubhouses eventually faded, especially post-1960s, but the habits would stay in place for a long time afterwards. Borough presidents, district leaders, and county chairs still shape who runs, who wins, and what gets funded. Politics in New York has always moved through 5 parallel systems. It still does. That brings us to today, where each borough still has a president, but with little governing power. It's much more symbolic these days. They don't write laws or command city agencies. The boroughs are now mostly names on a map, and sources of overwhelming sectarian pride for New Yorkers. The real power sits with the mayor and city council. For many residents, that structure feels distant. You vote for a borough president, but they can't fix the trains, adjust school funding, or change police priorities. But formal power isn't everything. Local resistance still matters, sometimes more than official authority. A citywide plan might have the mayor's backing, but if a neighborhood pushes back hard enough, it can stall or die entirely. For example, the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, a critical link between Staten Island and the rest of the city, was held up for years by local opposition in Brooklyn. Bay Ridge residents fought the bridge's construction because it would tear through their streets, which is a fair point, and their protest delayed the project for over 4 decades, until finally opening in 1964. Even something so clearly needed citywide was almost derailed by one borough's objections. This is how housing policy and infrastructure projects in general work in New York. The city says yes, the borough says maybe, and the neighborhood says no. The flip side is that this is a positive. as these local resistance abilities can help curb exploitative, oftentimes politically connected development. But what this really reveals is how fractured the city still is. New York may be unified on paper, but in practice it operates like a layered system. Borough identities remain strong. Services are uneven, and in many ways the original divisions still shape how the city works. Critics have long noted that city government is often exceedingly Manhattan-centric, with the outer boroughs feeling like the poor stepchildren of City Hall. That complaint, that Manhattan gets the lion's share of attention and investment, has echoed for over a century. Cross a bridge and things change. Your school quality, your hospital, even how quickly police show up. The city runs under one Department of Education. There's one NYPD and one public hospital system. But in practice, each borough feels like its own world. A 2023 report found that around 2 million New Yorkers live in what they call transit deserts, a place where reliable public transportation is far away or doesn't exist. Unsurprisingly, these deserts cluster in the outer boroughs: South Brooklyn, Eastern Queens, Northern Bronx. And without fast transit, access to jobs, education, and healthcare drops too. It's a similar narrative to what we see in states dominated by one city, to the point where over 30 Illinois counties have voted to explore seceding from the state. Except the difference is that it's all about separating from just a single city. We've seen this happen a few times. Staten Island got the furthest, because 65% of them actually voted to leave in 1993, but their efforts died on state constitutional grounds. Even as of recently, these talks still persist. In a way, this isn't new. The same tensions that made consolidation controversial in the 1890s, fears of losing local control, unequal representation, cultural mismatch, are still here, just in different forms. The borders may have disappeared on a map, but the mindset hasn't. But this is the gift and the curse of New York City's boroughs. Queens is the most linguistically diverse place on Earth. Over 160 different languages are spoken there. You can take one subway line and hear 5 different ones. In the Bronx, hip-hop was born in a rec room on Sedgwick Avenue. It shaped global culture before it was ever taken seriously by the city. Brooklyn's brownstones, bookstores, and block parties built a brand people now copy worldwide. Staten Island has the greenest space in the city, with more parkland per capita than any other borough. And Manhattan is the face of it all. The skyline, the stock exchange, Times Square, the setting of endless novels and ambitions, and of course, the concrete jungle itself. All the money, power, and iconicness a place could have. None of this came from central planning. It came from neighborhoods doing their own thing. That's the borough system. Thank you for watching.